Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you GIMP, the GNU image manipulation program, and give you a basic understanding of how to use the program for things like editing images and photos. So we're going to keep the focus of this video on the most important tools inside of GIMP, and we won't cover everything, but you should get a good idea of where you can go from here. So first off, if you want to start on a new image document inside of GIMP, there's the menu bar up at the top. Like many other programs, if you want to start a new document, you can go to File and then New, or you can hit Control-N at the same time as a hotkey combination. And when you do it, it's going to give you this Create a New Image window. So by default, you're going to have image size width, which is talking about the distance in terms of pixels from this side to this side. And then there's going to be height, which is bottom to top. Now, this can be measured in pixels, which is generally what you want to use if you're only worried about digital formats. But if you need to print anything out later, you may prefer to do something like inches and then customize the pixels per inch. So if we go to advanced options here, you can see that you can change the pixels per inch, which you might want to make something like 300 if you're trying to do a very high quality printout of an actual image. For instance, let's say you're making a poster. That would be an example of when you need to change it from pixels to inches, or if you're on the metric system, centimeters or meters. But here we'll go back to pixels for now, and we can return the image size to something more reasonable. So for instance, I often do things at 1920 by 1080 pixels because that's the standard 1080p resolution for video, but also thumbnails that you might see on a YouTube video. Also, in the advanced options, you may notice that the default fill is the background color, which is going to be whatever color you have selected here in this tools sidebar. So the color that's behind is always the background color. So that means if I create this, it's going to be created with background color white. So if I hit OK here, we get a new image document with a background layer, and that background is white. So if you just wanted a different background color, you can either change it before or after you go ahead and create your new document. Also, one thing that's very important here is that there's a switch button. So if you ever want to change the foreground and the background colors, you can just hit this little tool right here. So up here in the top left, we have a bunch of very useful tools. This is the tools window, by the way, which if it's ever missing, you can go up to the menu bar at the top and open with Windows, dockable dialogues, tool options. Or if you've closed it recently, you can also find it in recently closed docs. So we'll try to spend a good portion of the rest of this video going over some of these basic tools. But before we do that, let's go ahead and import an image into this document so that we can start editing it. Now before we do that, let's talk a little bit about how GIMP documents work and importing an image into GIMP. So if we were to go up to the File menu, and save this document, it's not going to be saving as an image, but instead what it's going to be saving as is a .xcf file. Now the reason you would want to save as a .xcf file and not a PNG or a JPEG image is that these GIMP documents will store information about things like the different layers you have in your document, so that when you open it back up, you can edit the image, having all of the changes that you made previously not compiled into one image, but actually kept on separate layers, which is really important if you ever want to make any changes. Because let's say you add some text to an image, and then you export it to a PNG, changing the text on that image without ruining the image becomes very difficult, and that's why layers are so important. So here we'll just save this document as, let's say, tutorial, and save it. So now all the information you're seeing on screen right now has been saved into a .xcf file, which is just the GIMP format for these documents. Now if we ever want to export what we currently have showing on screen to a new file, an image file, we would instead go to File and then Export. So when you do that, you can use one of many different formats. Generally speaking, you're going to want it to be a .jpeg if it's going to be an image that does not require transparency and you want it to be compressed to the smallest file size possible, or .png, where your image may have transparency in the background and you want that transparency to be stored in the image file, so that if you were to, say, put an image up on a web page, it wouldn't be a square shape, it would instead only show the areas that aren't fully transparent. so that technically the file is a square image, as all images on the computer are, but you can give the illusion of it just being whatever shape you have inside, like a logo, for instance. For now, I'm just going to hit cancel here because we don't really have anything to export yet. Now you might notice that in the file menu there's not really an import function. So how I usually import files is that I would go to a location on my computer in Windows Explorer, or whatever the equivalent is on your operating system, and to grab the image and just drag it in. So let's see, which one might we want to work on? How about this church image gotten from Pixabay? By the way, if you want free images to work on, Pixabay is an amazing free source for that. So now we have the image inside of our document. Note that the size of this image is different from the size of our canvas. You can see this white area down here below and the white area up above. If I was to hide both layers, you can see the full canvas, which, when nothing's showing, is totally transparent because there's no actual color anywhere on the canvas. So you have to keep that in mind. When you're exporting, you're not just exporting this church image we imported in, but you're actually exporting the entire canvas and all of the layers over here on the side as one image. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. So I guess now would be a good time to demonstrate one reason why the layers are so useful. So we have a background layer, which is obviously white, right? So if I hide the church layer over here on the right, the image hides, but we still have the background layer. Even though the church image is completely over the background for the areas that it's in, the background still exists there. So what we could do, if we wanted to change the entire background without changing the church, is we could go over here to the Paint Bucket tool that's on the top left. If you've ever used any tool like Microsoft Paint, you probably know exactly what the Paint Bucket tool does. So we can select these color selectors, the foreground color and the background color. The bucket fill by default paints with the foreground color, of course. And then we can just select a color here. So we have a lot of different slider bars that we can use to choose a color. Usually I just use this tool over here and this kind of scroll wheel in order to pick out the color that we want. So what would be a good background color here? In general, I think the colors that are pretty dark, so something like a orange or a red would be pretty solid. Honestly, I'd probably make it black usually, but just to make it a little bit more interesting. Let's take the Paint Bucket tool now, and if we hover over the main window of GIMP, we can see that the Paint Bucket tool is selected, and when we hit left click, it's going to paint with that Paint Bucket tool on the layer we currently have selected. So if I click here over the church image, it's actually going to be painting the background, even though it looks like I'm clicking on the church, but not really, because what matters is what layer you're actually on. And you can select the layer just by left-clicking over here on the Layers window. By the way, the Layers window, you can also close that, and you might not see it, so if you're ever missing it, you can always find it in dockable dialogues or recently closed dialogues. So currently, our canvas is set to 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. The church layer here is, in fact, 1920 pixels wide, a little bit less, like 1040 pixels tall. But we can always check our canvas size if we go up to the image layer and check canvas size, so you can see the size of the actual canvas. Also, note, if you wanted to change it here, you could do that, unchecking this link if you want to have the ratio change. But if you want the ratio to stay the same while you increase the width, basically you increase the width, you also increase the height, then just make sure that this link is checked. But I don't want to actually change the image size, so I'm going to hit cancel here. So let's talk about some other basic tools you have available to you. The pencil tool, right here and on the keyboard, if you want to select it using hotkeys, will give you a hard edge when you draw. So let's just zoom in a bit, somewhere not too unpleasing to the eye. And let's say we wanted to draw with some kind of blue color, just because, okay? And we have some tool options down here below the tools panel. Whenever you select a tool, it's going to give you tool-specific settings. So in this case, for the pencil, we can increase the size of basically the pencil head. So more size is going to make this a lot bigger. As you can see, 700 pixels is a ridiculous diameter. So let's lower that way back down to something like 15 pixels. You can also change the brush stroke for whatever tool you have selected. Now note, even though it says 50 hardness here, and if I went over to the next tool, the paintbrush tool, and it still says 50 hardness, the way that the pencil tool works has completely hard edges. So if I zoom in here and I left click and I start drawing a little bit, you can see how there's no smoothness to it at all. The edges end up with 100% of the hardness anyway, but if I was to use the brush tool in the same manner, you can see that on the edges it gets kind of blurry. And if we zoom out, it ends up looking like the brush stroke is a lot more natural in many ways, but the pencil tool really stands out. So if you ever needed to know which one you want, it's whether you want completely hard edges or if you want this blur. That will help you determine which tool to use here. Okay, now let's talk about adding text into your image. So with the text tool, which is this A letter here, you simply left click somewhere that you want to add text, and it'll give you this little tiny box with 4 corners. These corners basically represent the boundaries of your text box. So if I use the bottom right boundary and I drag this, it's going to extend the text box. Now, generally when you type in text to this box, it's going to automatically adjust the size of the text box anyway. So in many cases you won't actually have to worry about it, but you can use the corners and also the sides to manipulate the size of your text box and determine where it's going to go on your screen. Now, as far as changing things like the font color, the font size, and the font type, there's 2 places you can do that. One, when you have the text box selected, you can change the values of the text you have in this box for a one-time change by, say, typing in the name of the font you want, changing the font size, or clicking here for the color selector. But that will not apply to the next text box you create. It's only this one you're currently working on, or the text that you currently have selected inside of that box. You can't have 2 sets of rules for one text box. So for instance, if I type in some letters here and then I hit enter, create a new line, and I select this text and I change it to 40 pixels, you can see that the font down here gets bigger, but the original text stays the same because I didn't have everything selected. I only had this selected. And you can confirm that by saying 18 and 40. If you want to change it for basically the remainder of this document, any new text boxes you create, then you should instead change things over here in Tool Options. So I'm going to click on this button here to select a font, and I'll just go to one of my favorites and keep it simple, Babys Noy, which is one font available for free off of defont.com, a great source for fonts BS. And let's also make the font size 60 and change the font color to white, which is a far more normal font color. And you can see that these changes are immediately reflected over here as well because we haven't typed anything in yet. And if I choose a spot with left click to start typing, I can go ahead and type with these new rules. So why not just say new rules? And then I click a new box and it copies over here too. So as long as we have set these values over here on the left in Tool Options, it doesn't matter how many new boxes we create, those will be the defaults inside of that box. Now we have a very common problem, which is white text against a very white background, which makes it very hard to actually read the text. So one thing we can do with text like this, instead of changing the font color to a blue like that, we can select this text and add drop shadow to it. So whenever we create a text box, it also creates a new layer over here. So these are text-based layers. And I can right-click on one of these layers, do alpha to selection if I want to create drop shadow right behind where those texts are. So by doing text to selection, it selects the outer boundaries of the text itself, making it the perfect selection to go up to Filters, Light and Shadow, and Drop Shadow. Now, in most cases, I would uncheck Allow Resizing here before you add Drop Shadow in, because if you allow resizing, that means that the canvas of your document can resize, and usually that's something you want to manually do and not just let the system do for itself. If you want the drop shadow to be more obvious, you can increase the opacity, you can change the color, increase the blur radius, just pretty simple settings there. So I'm going to hit OK here, and you're going to see that now we have drop shadow added behind that text. Makes it a lot easier to read against that kind of background. And we can also do alpha to selection on this text box, go up to filters, and since we just used the drop shadow effect, we can copy that drop shadow effect one more time by hitting repeat drop shadow, and we get the same effect on that text box too. So I'm going to delete this box down here, and now we can start talking about some selection tools. So the two primary ones you have for simple shape selections are rectangle select tool and ellipse select tool. So as these icons might imply, rectangle select tools can be squares, but also other rectangle shapes as long as it has 4 corners where the length of opposite sides are equal. And then you have the ellipse select tool, which can make a perfect circle, but it can also make any oval-based shape. So let's say that we think that this text still doesn't show up well enough, and so we want to put like a background behind it. What we can do is go over to the Layers window, hit this New Layers button for that selection, and now with the Rectangle Select tool, we can left-click and drag a rectangle box around that text. And what we can do now is right-click it, go to Edit, and then fill with foreground or background color. And by doing that, we basically take the selection and we turn it into an actual colored box for our document. And this is on a new layer. One thing to note here is that this layer is above the church layer. If I was to bring this black box layer below the church layer, it becomes invisible because the church layer has 0 transparency, so you can't see it at all. So note that the layer order really matters. So let's do it one more time with the new rules using the ellipse select tool. So with the new rules layer, I'm going to move it using the move tool, which you can select with M on the keyboard, or it's right here in the tools panel. And I'm going to drag it to kind of center it, kind of with the text that's below it. Note that this leaves the drop shadow behind because the drop shadow was created on its own layer. That's not really a problem though, because we can just re-add the drop shadow. So I'm going to delete the drop shadow 1, which corresponds with the new rules. I'm going to alpha to selection, and we will repeat the drop shadow and just add it back in. So now, with the ellipse select tool, I can drag a oval around that text, and I can also adjust the sides of the oval in the same way you can adjust the text box for text to kind of make it more evenly distributed on all 4 sides. And we can go to New Layer to create a layer where we actually want to put this on. I'm going to put it below the text because I want the text to show over this layer fill, because I want the layer fill to hide behind the text. And now let's actually change the color from white here for foreground to something else. Let's make it kind of a darkish blue, just something to make it different than the black box down here. And we'll repeat the same process. So right-click, edit, fill with foreground color, and now we have a blue ellipse where the text is sitting on top of. And if we zoom in, you can still see that the drop shadow is showing there. Because if the black box background is black and the drop shadow itself is black as well, it's impossible to tell the difference because it's the same color. Okay, so a few more useful tools might be rotate, scale, shear, perspective. These are tools for manipulating how a layer looks, so we're just going to focus on scale and rotate here because these other ones are kind of more for faking 3D looks. Like if you want to make an image appear on a computer screen, you can do that with the perspective tool, but usually you just kind of want things to be 2D. So with the scale tool, we can take this church layer and we can left click on it. If you hold Control down, it will scale the same ratio so that the image keeps its form and shape. But if you let go of Control, you can kind of scale it to whatever sizes you want. So I'm going to just scale it down here and shrink it a little bit. When you're satisfied with the new size, you can hit Scale. Now we can move it a little bit more if we wanted to. And kind of unintentionally, I kind of created a border there. So now the background layer is actually serving as a border for this image. That's kind of cool. The rotate tool, kind of similar. We can left click on a layer and we can spin it around until it's got the new shape and the new angle that we're looking for. In this case, I'm going to hit cancel there. No real need for that. Okay, so let's see. A couple more tools we can touch on. Gradients. it's very similar to Fill Bucket, except that instead of one color, you can have multiple colors and you can have multiple opacity levels. So you have a lot of different gradients that are by default here. But if you ever wanted to edit a gradient, you can select your default from the list here. And then you can hit this edit button over here, where the gradient editor window will pop up over here, allowing you to do things like change colors, change center points, and change opacity for different things. But for right now, let's just show how a gradient might work. So I'm going to hide the church layer temporarily, and I'm going to create a new layer. And this layer is going to be a new background that sits on top of the background layer. So currently, I have the gradient foreground to background color selected. So that means that the foreground color here is the color on the left, and it will transition into the color that's on the right, which is the background color of black. Let's say we actually make the foreground color this red here. So how we can do that is with the color picker tool, which is the top right tool on the keyboard, and just simply left click where you see a color. By default, it will get the color from the layer you currently have selected, so the background layer there. But if instead you want to sample the complete color with all the layers combined, you can check sample merged here. But we just want that red color from the background layer. So now I'm going to go up to layer 2. And let's actually start by copying the color from the foreground to the background. So I'm going to copy this HTML notation for the red color. I'm going to click on the background color and copy that in. Hit tab to make it update, and now that color has been added in here. But I'm going to make it a bit lighter. So now I can go ahead and hit OK here. And if we go back to the gradient selector, you can see that the gradient we're actually painting with is very different than it was before, because our foreground and background colors have changed. So now if we left click and we drag a direction, it will try to create a gradient. By default, the shape is linear, so from the starting point towards the end point will look something like this. You can notice that's a little bit more interesting than just having one solid color in many cases. But you can also have different shapes. So for instance, if you want a square shape where the center point will be where the foreground color is, and then in all directions, it becomes the background color on the outside. That's one other shape that's available to you. So if I draw it bilinear here, at the center point, it's going to have this line here. And then on both sides, it's going to start going towards the background color. But in both directions, not just one direction. I think most gradients are probably linear though, so I'll just go ahead and use a linear shape there. Note that the background layer, the original background layer, is being completely covered up by this new gradient layer, and I'm just going to leave it like that for now. So now we can re-hide the church layer. You can see that the border here is a little bit more interesting. By the way, another way that you can add a border in pretty quickly is to go up to the Filters menu, Decor, Add Border, and then to choose a border color. So, I don't know, we'll just go with this pink here for a second. You can choose to give it a size, so I'll make it 25 pixels for all sides, and hit OK. And doing this does actually increase the size of your canvas, so that's one thing to keep in mind. But you can see how it gives you kind of an interesting border shape on all of the corners. Using that color, it actually creates several different shades of that color. But we're going to hit Ctrl Z right now because we don't really need that. So just a couple more tools really quickly here. The Free Select tool, if you ever want to draw your own selection by hand around some object that's in your screen, you can do that. Just connect them at the end. And then you can hit Ctrl X on your keyboard to cut it out completely. Obviously, that's a pretty crude way of cutting things out, so a better option would be the Scissor Select tool. And with the Scissor Select tool, you kind of set these key points, and GIMP will try to figure out, based on the colors in your image, where the borders of your object are. So, you cut around, and especially if you go all the way around an object, it'll be really useful. So if you make your complete selection around the object, you can see that on areas like here, where you have the sky and the chimney, it really does a decent job of actually making that selection a lot better than you'd probably get freehand. So once your selection is made, you can just click inside and it will convert all of those key points to an actual selection. and we can hit Control-Z to cut it out. By the way, let's say that you didn't want to get rid of it, but you just wanted to put it on a new layer. Well, we can move it to a new layer by creating a new layer, and then just hitting Control-V, and now that part of our image is on a completely separate layer, which is really useful if you want to make changes to this selection only, but not the entire document. So, just for fun, let's say that one of those ridiculous changes we wanted to make was to blur it out. So the Blur and Sharpen tool, if you want to make something less defined, you can use Blur, which Shift-U on your keyboard as the hotkey. So I'm going to drastically increase the size up here, just so that you can really see what's going on here. And because we created this separate layer, if I blur here, which I'll do by left-clicking now, you can see it doesn't affect the sky in the background. So, you know, having those separate layers is really, really handy when you're working inside of GIMP. And now you can see down here also the bricks below, not part of this pasted layer where we're currently working on, also not going to get blurred out. Now, the opposite of that, which you can trigger by hitting Control or by changing it by coming down here in the tool options, kind of does the opposite. It's going to take an image which might have some blur and try to sharpen it. Of course, it's not like an image can really add detail that doesn't really exist there before, so if you sharpen things too much or beyond where they were originally, it might look kind of weird, so I don't honestly use that all that much. So if you really want high detail in your images, I would just recommend you get a really good camera and you take them at high resolutions to begin with, so that you can decide how much detail you want to export that at, but when you take them, they have all the detail you could ever want. The smudge tool, which is right to the right, is similar, except that when it kind of blurs things out, it's going to be changing the original position of the data, where you're kind of smudging it to the side. So not exactly the same as blur, but does make it look blurry in a way. And then the last tool we'll talk about in this video, though there's obviously more tools available for you, the Dodge Burn tool. So when you dodge, you're making something lighter than it was originally, so I'm going to dodge this area here. And when you burn, which is the opposite, once again, you can hit Control on your keyboard, or you can change the type to burn. It's going to be making things darker. Oh, what? I forgot to hold down Control. So Control, and you can make things darker. Note that, you know, because there's separate layers here, I can't actually burn or dodge the areas over here unless I change specifically to the church layer, which I could do. So let's do that. And then we dodge here a little bit, and it makes it darker. But you can see it's not darker in the sense that it's changing directly to black, but it kind of keeps the color balance between the areas being dodged or lightened. So let's dodge this a little bit, just to kind of show off the difference. And especially when you're working on something like a person's face, it can give you some pretty cool effects. Okay, the very last thing we'll cover in this video is opacity. So every layer has opacity, and that is what percentage of this image is going to be see-through. So if I change the opacity to 50, that means that the image becomes 50% see-through, or at least the layer we currently have selected. And what that means to have a partially transparent layer is that the layers underneath will start to show through. So as this opacity shifts more and more towards 0, it's becoming more and more completely transparent, and the layers beneath start to show. So you can see how the gradient from this layer 2 actually starts to show on the final image, even though all layers are enabled for visibility. So there's applications for that. For instance, if we take these black box layers and I make that partially transparent, you can start to see things like the sunset to show through this black box. And so you still have the black box, though it now looks more gray, and behind it you see the sunset. So likewise, we can do the same thing with this blue oval over here, allowing the background to show through a little bit more. And hopefully you can imagine some ideas for where having partially transparent layers allows you to make your image a little bit more interesting. So we've covered a lot in this video, and I hope that this has given you a really good idea of what you can do inside of GIMP and how you can do many of those basic functions. If you want to learn more about GIMP, I would recommend checking out my full course, which I'll put in the description for this video. So in any case, thank you for watching to the end. I've been Chris, and I will hopefully see you guys in my future video content.